The FBI is launching a hate crime investigation into the mass shooting that killed 10 people and injured 3 others inside of a supermarket on a Saturday in Buffalo, New York. The shooter, Prayton Gendron of Conklin, New York, wrote a manifesto. And in that, he posted it on Google Docs on a Thursday. By Saturday, he was live streaming this mass shooting for the world to see. And in his manifesto, he said that he felt like white people were being replaced by minorities. Here to talk about this, I had to call on someone. I didn't want to talk to a politician, but someone who has been on the front lines fighting for racial justice. He's a leading intellectual of our time, and he comes from a place of love consistently, and that is who you see here with me, Dr. Cornel West, one of the most prolific writers that I have ever come across. Dr. West, thank you for coming on American Urban Radio Network.
I thank you, and I want to begin by saluting you. You being a force for good. I know in difficult contexts, holding on to your truth-telling and integrity, and I appreciate that very much so.
Thank you. Dr. West, what were your thoughts when you saw the headlines come across your screen, or you got the call or the text, look what's happening in Buffalo?
You know, I thought of the last speech of the great Malcolm X in Rochester, New York, February 16th, 1965, where he said that Black people are not just victims of a racist order, but Black people are prisoners of war. That there's been a war going on for 400 years, from slave ship to slave auction, to plantation, to lynching tree, to mass incarceration. And so in that sense, I wasn't surprised. You know, I mean, as a Christian, I'm never surprised by evil. I'm never paralyzed by despair. I have to fortify myself. I got to get ready. I put on my armor. And so we get another manifestation of this war that's been going on. It's psychic war, it's spiritual war, it's social war, it's economic war, and it's physical war. It could be Emmanuel Church, it could be Buffalo, New York. It goes on and on and on.
He talked about the fear of replacement, that he felt like white people were being replaced. Now, that is a theme that we hear. We heard that in Charlottesville when we saw the chanting of white supremacists, "We will not be replaced." And this has been going on, this has been going on for centuries. When you heard that was the reason, what is this replacement theory? What are the roots of this fear?
Well, I think that when you have a sense that you have been in full power and some of your power is lessened, then you feel as if you're being replaced. I mean, you go to Harvard University, if 100% of the faculty was white, and now 75% of the faculty is white, you could feel like white folk are being replaced. Who they're being replaced by? Asians, not too many Black folk, but Asians and others, right? So that replacement becomes a rationalization of an acknowledgement that some kind of transition is taking place, which is to say some kind of progress for Black folk have been taking place. 50 years ago, there was no White House correspondent folk in your job. It was lily white, whiter than the National Hockey League. So
and it's not that many of us who've come through those doors.
Exactly. So now you got a few of y'all, brilliant sister like yourself. Well, a white person was replaced 50 years ago. So that it's just an acknowledgement of fairness, trying to break through, some kind of justice for Black people, people of color trying to break through. And that is perceived as replacement rather than improvement.
Well, are we occupying seats that we should have occupied?
Oh, absolutely.
While I celebrate Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, this should not be the first.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the reality is, I think Sister Jackson's too good for the court. I mean, you
Come
know,
on.
it's just too good for the court. It's like Aretha. It's too good for the recording industry. So
But
we
still
talk
got to
about
show me your papers.
that's right, but you still got to show your paper. But we're talking about standards. The court is supposed to stand for justice. Ida B. Wells Barnett and Frederick Douglass and Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer stand for a justice that the Supreme Court ain't never stood for to this day. You see?
I want to, a lot of times, I mentioned the shooter in the beginning, but WGRZ went through, they did interviews with some of the relatives. And one of the, so 11 victims were African-American, 2 were white, 4 were store employees. 1 was a retired police officer, Aaron Salter, who was he was the youngest, actually. He was in his 30s. When I looked at the list, it just did something to me. And I'm gonna read a couple of the names off that they interviewed the relatives. And I was curious about their lives. Ruth Whitfield, 86, was one of the victims. She was on her way from visiting her husband in a nursing home and stopped at the store to get something to eat. 86 years old, visiting her husband. I had to think about what has she seen in her life, and this is how it ends. Pearlie Young, listen to that name, 77. She loved singing and dancing, and she ran a food pantry, right? She was helping her community. She was a community keeper. And 72-year-old Catherine Massey, these names, they're women who I feel like I could have known. She used to write for the Buffalo News. And then you got 62-year-old Celestine Janey, 6 grandchildren and 1 great-grand. She was a cancer survivor. I almost choke up when I hear that because it just felt like those are our mothers.
So that's my mother just passed 88 years old. Can you imagine her passing in that way? These are precious human beings, priceless children of God who go in that way, given this vicious kind of cowardly terrorist act of a white supremacist. I mean, I hear exactly what you're saying. I really do. But, I think it's part of a larger trend, though. You see, we're moving toward a neo-fascist America. Weighed with the various attack now on the women's controls over their bodies,
yes.
The voting rights being pushed aside, and the inability of the Democratic Party to undercut that filibuster so that our rights just dangling in the wind. The American democracy is not just being pushed to the edge, but it's about gone. That's why we got to fight. We got to fight spiritually, morally, politically, socially, and economically, and we got to be organized because what Malcolm said about this this war, and we cast it in a moral, spiritual way. People say war, they think it's a physical kind of war. That's why we have never had a black version of the Ku Klux Klan. We didn't opt that way. You see, we opted for moral and spiritual greatness. We didn't opt for a kind of military gangsterism. We refuse to get in the gutter like those who were in the gutter trying to push us in. Like Emmett Till's mama, I refuse to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. She's standing there looking at her child. And see, that's a level of moral and spiritual greatness that black people have had at our best. And that's what's been the leaven in the American democratic loaf. And if we hadn't opted that way, there'd have been a civil war every generation. There'd be civil strife every generation. There'd be terrorist cells in every black community. But no, we opted following Frederick Douglass. We follow Sojourner Truth. We follow Harriet Tubman. We follow Martin King. We follow those love warriors. We ain't even got the John Coltrane Love Supreme yet.
Come on now.
Oh, Stevie Wonder's Love in Need of Love. Toni Morrison's D Love It. Hey, Curtis Mayfield. We got a whole wave of love warriors. Country ought to give us a standing ovation. All the hatred that coming our way, and we keep dishing out love. Hey,
it's
all this
been our
trauma.
Soundtrack.
Exactly.
It's been our soundtrack. Even listening to a Bob Marley, when you
yes.
use
And
the righteousness and
was Bob Marley and the Impressions. He imitating Curtis Mayfield before he went down to Jamaica and manifest his genius and turned it to the Wailers. It's a diasporic. It's a global affair. But the thing is that as neo-fascism escalates in the country, the question will be whether there's enough leaven in the loaf or whether that loaf gets so stale.
That's a good question because so this conversation isn't new because when I go back and I look at the Black scholars and leaders who I have learned from and still glean from that are now our ancestors and looking over us from a Baldwin to Du Bois
Absolutely.
to Douglas, who have been talking about what happens if America does not deal with racism. There are so many other issues, but we keep coming back to that. America's like, oh, we've dealt with it. We kind of moved. We have not moved past it. We don't want to deal with equity because that's really also at the end of it. And in your book, because you are one who, my God, who I have gleaned from, you wrote in Race Matters. Of course, the aim of a constitutional democracy is to safeguard the rights of the minority and avoid the tyranny of the majority. You recently been talking a lot about responding to essays, is democracy lost? And you just said, is there enough leaven in that loaf? Where do you see us turning? Because you've also, I read in an article that you said that because of the protests of George Floyd, it's brought America to a turning point. But that turning point is starting to feel like an Autobahn. And it's like, okay, when is the turn when we really see things change?
That's true. I mean, history is so unpredictable. It's always incomplete and unfinished. But we're certainly at a low point. We have to keep in mind, you see, when we talk about neo-fascism, white supremacy is the public face. And that's why the attack on Black people. You got the attack on Asians, that you remember. You got the attack on our brown brothers and sisters in El Paso and so forth. Yeah. That you got attack on the Jewish folk there in Pittsburgh.
The Haitians that we see trying to cross.
Haitians being exactly if they were treated like Ukrainians, Haitians would have been here a long time ago, right?
Come on now.
And we're in solidarity with the Ukrainians, but oh, lo and behold, we can find money for them. So the question becomes: you got big military in the back, and you got big business in the back, and the public face of neo-fascism is white supremacy coming at us because we got a long history of being treated in vicious ways, from slavery to neo-slavery to the new Jim Crow, our present moment. So, but the question becomes then, what do we do?
Yeah.
We can't become deferential. We can't get scared. We can't get intimidated. The very folk whose names you read, these are people of great dignity, of great grace, of great determination. You 86 years old and still in your right mind in white supremacist America as a graceful Black woman, you know you got some steel in your back. You got some fire in your soul. We got to allow that fire to become part of our life, part of that afterlife. Her fire got to be the fire in our life right now as we bear witness.
One thing that, even as a journalist, that I kind of push back on people, sometimes we start this conversation with Trump administration. Right. And while I understand it ain't even a dog whistle, things that were coming out of that administration that were leading to what we saw with the January 6th insurrection, I cannot start this conversation with that administration because I can go back decades and look at segregation still being in schools, even though we don't like to talk about it. I can talk about communities. We can go to Flint, Michigan, and talk about the water crisis. We can talk about lead and water for Black communities for a whole conversation.
Mass incarceration.
Mass incarceration. This did not begin here. This has been one of those things that's like in the scripture, it talks about it, the devil crouching at your door because you have not learned to deal with certain things. And so this is part of that momentum. Dylan Roof, that was 2015 at Mother Emanuel AME Church. That wasn't under this administration. So I want to caution people to just make this a right and left issue, starting with that administration. We've been having to deal with this issue.
But it goes back to the founding of the nation. White supremacy is as American as apple pie. It was the serpent wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the founding fathers signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Okay, you got some good words in there, but in practice, both documents were pro-slavery for Black people. And we had to have a civil war in order to break the back of the most barbaric institution in the modern world, which was the enslavement of New World Africans. Yeah. And so from the very beginning, you got this cooked into the cake of the country. And the country can either go in one direction, which is a move toward good, or what John Coltrane would call forces for good, or it can move toward forces for evil. And what we see in Buffalo, another manifestation of the evil. And we
you can't you use the cake analogy. You know, when you got a bad cake, your grandma didn't try to fix that cake up. She started all over.
She got to revamp it. She had to
look at that. What am I putting in it? Did I let it sit too long? Are y'all making too much? You know what I mean? You remember?
And I don't want to poison my children because she loved it. Of course, our problem is we are unloved people. We are hated people, you see. And it's a hatred, it's a contempt, it's a hostility, or in professional context, too often, it's a disrespect and a devaluing and a marginalizing of talent. I'm talking about Black professionals now, where the hatred gets reshaped into a certain kind of disrespect and devaluing, you see. But white supremacy has a number of different forms. And of course, the white supremacy is also inside of Black people, because we internalize it and think less of ourselves, less beautiful, less moral, less intelligent. And white supremacy continues to do its work on the inside of Black people. We got to fight that as well.
Man, this is, I could keep you here forever, but I know I can't. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, and that is, we talk about this country has been facing a moral reckoning, and that really has been happening since 1619. MLK said that justice for Black people will not flow into this society merely from court decisions nor from fountains of political oratory. White America must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. I'm gonna hit you with the title of, where do we go? Where do we go from now? And I'm also juxtapose that against a Twitter message that you wrote to your friend Shireen Abu that died. You just saw die. You said she hated domination and occupation based on a deep love for oppressed people, especially Palestinians, because it's the global fight. Let us never forget her courage and witness. What can we glean even from her death, and where do we go from here, Dr. West?
Yeah, well, one is we have to have a moral integrity, ethical consistency, which is to say we've got to hate domination and occupation no matter where it is. If we hate what the Russians are doing in the Ukraine, and we ought to, then we ought to hate what's happening on the West Bank in Gaza in terms of Israeli occupation. Ain't got nothing to do with anti-Semitism, ain't got nothing to do with anti-Jewish hatred. If it was happening to Jews, we'd be in solidarity with Jews. It's a moral and a spiritual issue. And therefore, that kind of attitude, which is the attitude of the best of Black folk. You see, Jesus loved little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. They're precious in his sight. I learned
they act like Jesus was born in the U.S. and was raised in, I'm just like, what is this Christ? He was
born waving a U.S. flag. No, the cross. Every flag is under the cross. That cross stands for unarmed truth and unconditional love, focusing on the least of these because of his love of poor people. He runs out the money changers in the temple, not because he hates rich people. He hates greed. He hates hating people. He hates hypocrisy. He hates envy. He hates resentment. That has been at the center of the shaping of Black people in the modern world. That's where Martin King comes from. That's why he says what he says. And he said that from the grave. See, that's 1969, published after his death. That essay was published by James Melvin Washington, in A Testament of Hope. You see, he had to pull that from the grave from Martin. And Martin's voice, just like Malcolm, just like Fannie Lou Hamer's, just like Mary Lou Williams, just like Louis Armstrong, how much joy did he spread given all the vicious attacks on him coming out of Jim Crow, Louisiana. Where does he get that spiritual power, that moral potency? That's the witness of Black folk. So that even those Black folk killed in Buffalo, and the precious white ones too, their lives will continue to resonate in our lives as we never forget them. And that's true for Sister Serene, our dear Palestinian sister. Her life will never be forgotten, and we will bear witness against any form of domination and occupation. Why? Because they made in the image of God. They have a dignity and a sanctity that the world could never reduce to nothingness.
Brother West, Dr. Cornel West, I'm going to just let this sit with me. You can't have conversations this weighty and go on and do the next. I think even for this country, we got to let stuff sit. Let it marinate. Let what's inside of you talking, let it speak to you and lead you towards what you know that is right. I think we all have that. And I thank you for being who you are in this time and speaking to generations, for your wisdom. Like Solomon many times, for you, we talk politics, you go back to love and you intertwine love into that, because you even say if you can't talk about love and politics and separate those two things. If you love me, then do for my community. If you love me, love me, then why are the numbers when it comes to the wage gap? So that's not love.
That's exactly.
You can't love me and rob me at the same time now.
Ooh, tell it. Any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. You're going to need love to rescue justice. That's the history of Black folk at our best, and we're going to hold up that bloodstain.
All right.
We're going to be faithful unto death.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. I definitely want to have you come back to American Urban Radio Network and talk some more. It's a lot. We hit on Roe v. Wade, voting rights, student loan debt. I mean, everything.
Isn't that the truth? But again, I salute you. Bearing witness.
You
bearing witness in some high places now. It's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. Bearing witness wherever you go.
Yeah, it's a responsibility.
No, that's true.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Much love to you. And please come back again, Dr. West.
Oh, indeed, indeed. God bless you. Thank you so much.
God bless you.
Salute you. Love you.
All right. Bye-bye.